Riverside Avenue Preservation Community Garden. For $150 a year, I get a plot that's about 30 feet long by 4 feet wide. They supply the water, the soil, the wood. All I have to do is plant a seed and watch it grow. Now for you gardeners out there, you know that I'm oversimplifying things a little bit, but it's cheaper than therapy, and it's something that I can pass along to my children. I actually started growing things when I was a kid and got a very early start, but the first thing that I grew wasn't necessarily something that you could eat. It was something that you could smoke. All right, let me explain. My mother was a drug dealer. Nothing too crazy, mostly just marijuana, but she was a single mom trying to make ends meet. And she was doing the best that we can. And one day, I realized that what she was selling was something that I could grow in our backyard. So I made a deal with her. I took some seeds from her rolling tray, I planted them, she was gonna sell the weed, we were gonna split the profits, and I was gonna buy everything that I wanted to out of the Shopper Image catalog. I'm talking about the remote control submarine and the little robot that brings your drink to you, right? And I know what you're thinking, my mom's probably not the best parent in the world, but she had an interesting life. Colleen Ann O'Shea was born in upstate New York she was the daughter of first-generation Irish Americans. She went to Catholic school, used to tell me stories about the nuns wrapping rulers on her knuckles and making her do Hail Marys while kneeling on rice. So needless to say, as soon as she graduated high school, she moved as far south as she could, found a warm city, and it was Miami that she called home. Shortly after arriving, she got a job working in a very popular clothing store in Coconut Grove called the Motherlode. She had her best friend Carol with her, and by and large, these two young ladies were left to mind the store. The owners would come in about once a week, they'd take all the money out of the cash register, and then they'd disappear into the night. You see, the Motherlode wasn't necessarily a clothing store, it was a drug front, and my mom had just landed smack dab into the Miami drug scene in the mid-70s. That's where she met my father. Danny Ira Roth was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1948. He had two loving parents and lots of family that was all around. My grandfather had moved the family down to Miami when he was about 8 to pursue a career opportunity running a car wash. There was nothing really that led my father astray other than he really liked to smoke weed and he liked to make lots of money very quickly. And he had a passion for life. And so by the time he met my mother, their idea of a date was loading up a briefcase full of cash, flying out to California, and driving up and down the Pacific Coast Highway in a brand new Porsche that eventually they would leave at the airport. Life was pretty good. My father wasn't your typical drug dealer. He wasn't the guy that you bought a dime bag on the corner was. His job was more supplying Pennsylvania. So if you, your parents, your grandparents smoked dope in the city of brotherly love in the late 70s or early 80s, it most likely came through my father's hands. Life was pretty good for them until it wasn't. One spring day, a nosy neighbor noticed a U-Haul sitting out in front of our house in the Poconos a couple days too long. A few days later, the DEA broke through the front door and tore down a fake wall and found 2.5 tons of marijuana stashed behind it. Needless to say, their exciting lives got turned upside down, and I would never really know the life that I was just born into. Tough times came after that. I went to go live with some family while my parents figured out their legal troubles. Eventually, my mother was freed, and she came and picked me up and took me back down to Miami, but we really didn't have a home to go back to. I remember sleeping in cars, mobile homes, strangely enough, an orchid farm in Homestead for a little while. We eventually settled in a house in South Miami, right near the University of Miami. It was originally built by a botanist who liked to bring his work home. So my yard was filled up with fruit trees. It was the type of childhood where I just walked out my backyard and picked something out of a tree and I ate it right there on the spot. I guess that's where my proclivity for growing things came about. So at the age of 9, when I wanted to start growing pot plants, it made sense. I came home from school late one spring, and I was all excited because my pot plants were getting big and they were getting ready to harvest. And I was going to sell it. My sharper image dreams were going to come true. And I walked in, and my mom was kind of sullen, and she said, "Jason, I have some bad news. The DEA came today and stole your pot plants." What? What do you mean the DEA came to my pot plants? They were hidden. They were in the bushes. What? Why are you still here? Why didn't they arrest you? She said they let her off with a warning, and as I ran out to the back to see if, with my own eyes, if this was true, I started searching through the bushes to see if maybe they had missed one, right? Maybe I could just get one little robot from Sharper Image. And lo and behold, they had actually missed a plant. They had missed my mother's personal plant. It was a different strain. It was a hybrid. It was smaller, and I picked it up and I ran inside and said, "Mom, look, they missed your plant." She just looked up at me. She smiled. She said, "I guess we got lucky. Do you want to go to Benihana for dinner tonight?" It took me a couple years, as I mean like 10 or 20 years, to figure out what had actually happened, but I think my mom made out better on micro operation than I did. Life in my mom's house was interesting, and Saturday mornings were about two things: Hanna-Barbera cartoons and the weekly phone call that I would get from my father from prison. I was always so excited to tell him about what was going on at school and what my summer plans were, and occasionally he would give me a message to give to his father, or I would take an order down, something to order from the LL Bean catalog while he went and worked in a forestry camp. I still remember how I'd had to address anything to him. Danny Ira Roth, inmate Y6391. Y6391. When I was 12, my father got out of jail. And while I was thrilled, my mother was not. Their relationship had deteriorated, and up until then, it had pretty much been Jason and Colleen versus the world. So when my father started his straight and narrow life at the age of 43, my mother was still doing what my mother did, and I started to see the differences between the households. At my mother's house, there were bad people doing bad things that maybe a child shouldn't see. At my father's house was dinner at 6, and he was planning a vacation in North Carolina. I started to gravitate more towards my father because I wanted safety, I wanted security. I was becoming a teenager. I just, I wanted to be normal. My mother always said that I was her reason for living, and so when I eventually moved out of her house and moved in with my father, I took that reason for living away from her, and so she decided to stop living. Life at my father's house was interesting. You see, we didn't really have that father and son relationship that you have. He didn't really have the authority that one might have over someone that raised you, and so, when he would tell me to be home by midnight, I'd give him the finger and show up at 4 a.m. But we were really good friends. Really good friends. We had a lust for life. We'd go on vacations, and we had these sort of things that we would look for. We called it the theater of the absurd. Situations so crazy and people so crazy that all you could do was just laugh. We also had a motto. We said, don't think of the bad that could happen, think of the worst. We had some good years. About a month before I graduated high school, he went into the hospital for a hernia operation and came out with a cancer diagnosis. So as I was starting my college career at Florida State, he was starting his chemo treatments and going through a series of surgeries to try to remove the cancer, which had started in his colon, but had moved all around his abdomen. He gave up a pretty good fight for about 18 months. The night before he passed away, he was in what I can only describe as a morphine-induced haze. At that stage of life, it's not about extension of life, it's more about getting rid of the pain. But he had his lucid moments, and we talked as much as we could. One of the last things I remember my father telling me was a little bit about his former life versus his new life. He said, Jason, I've lived two lives. One where I made a lot of money and I traveled and I had a lot of fun, but I always had to look over my shoulder. I always had to see who was going to take it away. The other life, of which he worked for his little brother and was a legal investigator at a law firm, he put on a suit and tie every day and he went to an office and he helped people. He was around smart people and he just looked at me and he said, "Do that, Jason. Do that." So that's what I did. I went to college, graduated, met a girl, moved up to New York, got married to that girl, moved back down to Florida, bought a house, had a kid, and eventually landed here in Jacksonville, Florida. A couple of years into my tenure here, I became the Director of Public Policy for the United Way of Northeast Florida. I was doing exactly what my father wanted me to do. I was putting on a suit and tie every day. I was going to an office. I was doing good things. I was helping people. About a year into my tenure at United Way, I went up to a conference in Washington, D.C. By the omnipotent miracle that is Facebook, I had actually reconnected with one of my father's old partner's stepdaughters. I actually was better friends with her younger brother, who was only a few months younger than me. And so after 33 years, she was doing a show up in Baltimore. I jumped on the train, went up and saw her. She was a very talented musician from Nashville. And we reconnected. And naturally, I asked how her brother was doing. That's when she informed me that a couple years earlier, he had gotten popped for about 300 pounds of weed in his trunk. He had gone into the family business, and for it, he lost the first 3 years of his young son's life. And it was at that moment that I realized there are a lot of forks in the road. There are a lot of decisions that we make. Some decisions that are made for us and some that we make ourselves. But I'm just thankful that between all the forks in the road and all the decisions that I've made, on Saturday mornings, I can wake my kids up, I can drag them to the garden, and try to teach them to grow a tomato or two and not marijuana.